Good afternoon and welcome everyone to our webinar this afternoon on common myths and mix-ups. I am going to turn things over to our presenter for today. We're very privileged to have Bill Botten, who is going to present for us today, and I'm going to turn things over to him, and he can tell you a little bit more about himself and what he's going to talk about today. Welcome,
Thank you,
Bill.
Nancy. Thank you, Nancy. As Nancy said, my name is Bill Botten. I'm currently an accessibility specialist and doing private contract work and work with the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center every opportunity I get. I am a white male, 65 years old with blonde gray hair. The photo shows me in a white shirt. Today in the live video, I'm actually in a light blue shirt. Um, and what you can't see in the picture or in this video is that I'm also a person that uses a manual wheelchair. And I've used a manual wheelchair as a result of a motor vehicle accident where I left the vehicle because I wasn't wearing a safety belt back in 1983. And so I've been a paraplegic for the last 40 years and really started accessibility work on just my own desire to be able to get in places and understand where my legal rights were. Very fortunate to go through the process of vocational rehabilitation that sent me to college. And then for more than 20 years, I worked with the U.S. Access Board, doing technical assistance, helping to write guidelines, and also working as their training coordinator and providing technical information through webinars and guides and other materials. And so I feel very fortunate today to have this opportunity to talk to you. And some of the subjects that we're going to talk about, and there's a lot, right? When we talk about these different issues that are either not well understood or constantly messed up in the construction or even some of the design work. This could be a webinar that lasts all day long. But we're going to talk about application. We'll talk about construction tolerances because that always seems to be an issue. Drinking fountains, believe it or not, is one of those things that we get a lot of questions about. Toilet and bathing, always a large part of the standard. We're going to talk about transient lodging and really some of the scoping requirements. Then we're going to break down dining, work surfaces, counters, all the different issues about that, whether it is a dining service, a work service, or is it actually a sales service counter. We'll go into handrails and really the extensions on ramps and stairways. Talk a little bit about assistive listening systems and their need and importance, and constantly overlooked in a lot of assembly areas. And we're going to talk about EV charging, and then I would be remiss if I didn't get squeak in a couple of issues that are in recreation facilities, because I've really spent most of my career working on providing or understanding access to outdoor developed areas and recreation facilities, and am a person that really enjoys those opportunities to get out in nature and also recreate along with my family and friends. So I'm going to move on now to slide number 13. And I just basically wanted to talk about that the 2010 ADA standards, remember, are the design standard for all new construction and alterations that have started or taken place from March 15th of 2012. And so they are the 2010 standards. Remember, these are developed through a two-step process. The U.S. Access Board, the agency that I formerly worked for, develops those minimum guidelines that then are adopted by the standard setting agencies. And I'm going to talk about DOT next. But in this case, the Department of Justice issued in 2010 the ADA standards for accessible design. And I think I'd like to even back you up just a little bit further and let you know that this is really construction requirements that are part of a civil rights law, right? And that civil rights law is that people with disabilities should have the same opportunity to participate and be included in all aspects of society. And so it's an overriding obligation that programs and services and facilities are accessible to and usable by, and that's the real trigger right there, right? Usable by people with disabilities. These standards apply to state and local governments covered under Title II and places of public accommodation and commercial facilities covered under Title III. The enforcing agency, as I told you, also adopted these, is the U.S. Department of Justice, and I've provided their technical assistance phone number, but also their website. And there are a lot of great information there and technical assistance information that could be gotten through them through phone call on their technical assistance hotline. And remember, not only are these construction requirements part of the standard, but the regulations as well. You know, what's effective communication? What's the standard for a service animal? All the different regulations are part of the Department of Justice's regulations, the Code of Federal Regulations. So I'm going to give you at the end of this an opportunity to have other resources for technical assistance. But if you want, go right to the source, the standard setting agency for state and local government facilities and programs and services, but also places of public accommodation and commercial facilities. Your resource can be the Department of Justice. Now, there are ADA standards that the Department of Transportation adopted in 2006, and there are a couple of differences. Not really too big, but one of the big deals that came out of the 2010 ADA standards compared to the earlier standard in 1991 was this idea of where the accessible route needs to be located. And that is that it needs to coincide the route that everybody else gets, what we call the common circulation path. And so the Department of Justice uses that same language in their standards, and their standards apply to facilities used by state and local governments to provide designated public transportation services, including things like bus stops and transportation stations and rail stations. And the unique provisions are just these four. And I'll tell you, if you go to the U.S. Access Board's website that I'm going to give you later, it also comes along with a note to the reader when you get to these specific provisions. So the accessible route provision that's in scoping is in 206.3. And on this slide, number 14, I'm also showing the Department of Transportation's logo. Some of the other provisions that are a little bit different in the Department of Transportation's standard is this detectable warning on curb ramps, where they say in 406.8 that the detectable warnings need to either be the full depth of the curb ramp or at least 24 inches measured back from the back of the curb on the ramp surface. And it also talks about two other provisions that you can find in Chapter 8, 810.22 and 810.53. And those address the bus boarding and alighting areas, but also the rail station platforms and how they connect with each other. So how those boarding and alighting areas connect with the transportation vehicle, and same with rail stations. What's that vertical change that's permitted, and how do they need to be in line with or connected to? Moving on to one of the other issues we're going to talk about today is those construction tolerances. And oftentimes people design to the maximum, right? Or the minimums. Listen, if it's a range, design in the middle, especially on ramp slopes. Don't design to the maximum of 1 in 12, because you're technically probably going to go over with some contractor's mistake, right? So bring it into those ranges, or specify some fudge room on your plans to make sure that you're not exceeding those maximum and minimums. And so sometimes construction tolerances can apply. And that is when there's an absolute dimension. And I'm showing you here a grab bar diameter and clearance graphic that shows that it's 1.5 inches absolute away from the wall for a grab bar. And why is it so important that we make that so that it's not bigger than that or smaller? The idea that we want that 1.5 inches so you can get your hand around that surface all the way around it and really grip it. But we don't want anybody's arm to fall behind it, right? And trap them. We don't want somebody's arm to fall in there and then not be able to get up out of there and trap them into that location. So that's why that 1.5 inches is so important. The diameter of the grab bar, though, is a range, right? It's a range from 1.25 inches to 2 inches for adults, and it can be smaller for children. I recommend going to the 2 inches, make it big, or close to 2 inches as possible. That's in that range, the expectation that a construction tolerance is built in. When you have an absolute dimension like this 1.5 inches away from the sidewall to the grab bar, that is where, in an absolute dimension, tolerances are allowed. And construction tolerances can be different for different types of manufacturing processes or different types of materials being used. I'm going to move on to slide number 16. And slide number 16 shows where there's this absolute. And let me just say that in the revision of the 1991 standard into the 2010 standard, there was a really great effort to try to reduce wherever there was absolute dimensions and make them all ranges. And the reason for that is it's so much easier to construct to, right? If you have a range, remember when there was an absolute dimension to the center line of a toilet? Well, people didn't know, or plumbers didn't know what type of wall surface was going to be used. So it's always so hard. So now even that's a range 16 to 18 from the sidewall. But what I'm showing you here on slide number 16 is that it's a construction tolerance slide continued, and it's using the transfer shower. And the transfer shower is an absolute 36 by 36, and that's supposed to be measured up from the floor about center line in both directions. So the back wall and the control wall both would be 36 inches. Now, since those are absolute dimensions, it's not a range, manufacturing tolerances could be recognized. And some of those tolerances might include, like at the bottom of the shower, maybe it's a pan that rotates in, or, it kind of curves in on all four corners instead of being an abrupt corner all the way to the floor surface. Maybe it's something like that they're not going to keep an absolute 36 all the way through there. So those manufacturing tolerances are permitted where absolutes are prescribed in the standard. The next issue we're going to go to is, where don't you see a bottle filler anymore, right? Or some type of water cooler in lieu of drinking fountains? Often happens, right? I just want to state that neither of those, bottle fillers or this water cooler that I'm showing here on slide number 17, can be used in lieu of drinking fountains. Now, once you start to provide drinking fountains, you have to provide two. Remember, the scoping is for the accessible unit for persons that are seated, and then one for standees. And I'll show you a little bit more of that here in upcoming slides. But once you've put in one drinking fountain, it requires two. I think the thing that I see most often is, like I'm showing you here, where a bottle filler is put at the back end of a accessible, the seated, for somebody using a mobility device to be able to come up to and drink from the seated level, or for children. And so this idea here where the bottle filler is at the back, remember that you cannot have an operable part beyond the knee and toe space provided. Remember, so 25 inches is the max it can be away from the front edge. I like to think of, where my beer belly hits the front edge of that drinking fountain, to where I've got to try fill that bottle can't be greater than 25 inches, because no operable part can be beyond my toes greater than 25 inches. So make sure that you're not providing, just a lowered unit and a bottle filler like the one I'm showing here. Remember, there's always got to be two in the same area, serving the same populations. It could be on the same floor, could be in the same outdoor area. They don't necessarily have to be connected. It doesn't have to be one unit with two, a high and a low. It could be separate units, but they have to be in the same area, serving the same population of people. So remember, a bottle filler is not in lieu of the high one, or this for ones for standees. But you could use just a bottle filler or just one of these water coolers in lieu of drinking fountains if you're never providing any drinking fountains, okay? But if you do provide these, a bottle filler or what I'm showing you here, a water cooler, the operable parts of the standard still apply. So would a clear floor space. It could be parallel, but a clear floor space would be required, and the operable parts would need to be looked at. I'm moving a little bit further and going into drinking fountains as protruding objects on slide number 18. And it's got two different graphics that are taken from guides right off the Access Board's website. And it's showing an individual using a cane for wayfinding, and they're tracking the wall. And it's showing them coming across to where there's a drinking fountain in an alcove, but it still protrudes the maximum that it can, 4 inches. So when we think of that projection coming off a lot of times the lower drinking fountain, that projection cannot be into a circulation path greater than 4 inches, remember, unless it's below 27. But that drinking fountain needs to be mounted right at 27 minimum right? For wheelchair access, knee and toe clearance. So you really need to be right on with that. I think the best way might be to put them in an alcove, or to make sure that they're not within the circulation path is always what's required. So here I'm showing you a couple different things that we just talked about, and that is, no matter what you have in this alcove, it still cannot protrude greater than 4 inches into a circulation path. And the wheelchair accessible unit is a 27-inch high absolute, can enclose on one side of the high units. So that could be the alcove that's created by that lowered unit. I'm showing that in the lower graphic here on slide number 19, where the common direction of travel would be to stay to your right, right? So you're tracking the hallway along the right-hand side. And the first object you come to is at 27 inches, which protruding objects in chapter 3 permit an object to be at 27 and still be cane detectable, but it's an absolute. I'm showing myself in this slide number 20 on the far right, and I'm at a recreation facility that uses a low unit, a high unit, and a bottle filler all in one. And the clear floor space is being shown outside and away from that high unit. Nancy, you want to stop me right here for a second?
I do. We had a question that's perfect right here, I think. The question is about the drinking fountains located in an alcove. If it's located in an alcove, then if it wouldn't be considered a protruding object, does that mean that the knee clearance could be higher than 27 inches? It could exceed that 27 inches.
Yeah, I believe the standard does require that as an absolute. I'll have to come back to you on that, or we can look that up while I'm going. But 27 inches would be the lowest possible height for knee and toe clearance. I believe you might be able to have it higher than that in an alcove. I actually sit a little higher than 27 at my knees and appreciate that additional height. And we'll talk a little bit about that at dining and work surfaces. But I need to go in and look at the actual site, or maybe you can, Nancy, and make sure that that's not an absolute there in chapter.
I'll do that. I'll do that.
Sounds great. And I'll move forward. What I wanted to show here in this slide number 20 was that graphic that shows where the opportunity to be outside that clear floor space for the standing unit and have the ability to have both individuals be able to use it easily. Okay, so this recommendation, locate the standee drinking fountain outside of that clear floor space for the wheelchair accessible units. Makes both more usable. I've also seen in recreation facilities where when you have this unit that has not only a high and a low, but also a bottle filler, sometimes they do have a dog bowl at the very bottoms of these in recreation facilities. Make sure that the operable parts for that dog bowl are available and within the reach ranges, no lower than 15 inches, and that is not placed in some clear floor space for the mobility accessible lower drinking fountain. So I just wanted to throw this in there that, you know, when we talk about some of these things that are not, they're mixed up or they're misused wrong or things like that, we're really talking about an individual's independence, aren't we? I mean, these minimum requirements are there to try to increase persons with disabilities' independence, their ability to do things on their own, not have to ask for help in a safe manner. There's nothing more important than when you're developing an area or a facility designed for children's use, that you use the dimensions for water closets and drinking fountains and grab bars and play tables and things like that, that honestly make it more independently usable for this younger population. And so I just wanted to show that there is this opportunity, if it is for children, that the option of a parallel approach to the drinking fountain with a spout at 30 inches maximum above the finished floor, and that spout 3.5 inches maximum from the front edge of the unit, including any bumpers, makes it more independent for somebody that really is sitting a lot lower and is going to try to get to this in a parallel approach. I oftentimes think too that Well, I have to sit parallel in a lot of different sinks, and I love the sinks that have the pull down or gooseneck thing that where you can bring it to yourself, because I can really get to both hands very well if I have that opportunity. In this one here, sometimes it can be very challenging, right, to lean that far off to the side to get to a drinking fountain. So sometimes cups or a bottle filler make it more independently usable for some. Nancy's back. Hi,
Well,
Nancy.
I looked in the standards and I found this is kind of interesting, I think, in the standards because for knee clearance in the text, it's not really expressed as a minimum or a maximum. It's expressed as the space that can be considered knee clearance is between 9 and 27 inches. The illustration shows it as a minimum, the 27 inches as a minimum
Yeah, it
knee
brings you
clearance.
back to, I think it brings you back to 306, doesn't it?
That's exactly what I'm looking at,
Yeah.
306, and that's the way it says it in text. Space under an
Yep.
element between 9 inches and 27 inches above the finished floor or ground shall be considered knee clearance. So I think that suggests, and then the image sort of supports the idea that it can be more, depending on probably the limitations of the top. For
The
example,
spout
with the drinking
location.
fountain, the spout
Yeah.
location, or if it's another
Yep.
type of surface that requires knee clearance, there's going to be some sort of a
Yeah.
counter surface or something. So I think that's kind of uh, interesting the way that's worded. And if you'd like, before we move on, we did have a question. I'm not sure you can answer this about the tolerances and the example of the transfer shower. And do you have any notion of how much tolerance is permissible?
Yeah.
The person says they had a manufactured base that would have made the unit about 40 by 40 if they didn't build out the walls. So that's quite a difference.
That
40
really
by
is.
40.
I would want to make sure that there aren't other manufacturers that produce something closer than that. Um, but if that is a manufacturing tolerance, they're unable to make it at 36 by 36. The example I was giving was where the corners were rounded. And so they could meet the 36 absolute if you came up the wall to a center line and then went across. Um, and in the corners it couldn't be met because of the structural support they needed in the corners there. I would be concerned if they were going to a base that's over 40 or 40 inches, that additional inches, and that was the manufacturing tolerance. Typically, things are closer than that, maybe an inch off or maybe 2 inches off. But I've not heard of typically a manufacturing tolerance that would be 4 inches in that 36-inch span of a transfer shower. So I would maybe look at other manufacturers for something that's closer to that absolute as possible. Well, nothing like stumping me right off the bat on that absolute or 27 inches minimum. I would probably shoot for the 27 and make it an absolute as close as I didn't realize that that was an absolute because you're that's a minimum for knee and toe space typically. And going above that a lot of times can facilitate some greater access. At least it does for me because I'm a tall person, so I sit very high in my wheelchair. And sometimes getting underneath things can be very challenging at just 27. Um, I'm going to move on now to another scoping issue, and it's in Chapter 2, 213. And I'm on slide number 22, and it has a graphic of the front door or the entrance door to both a men's and women's restroom with that high and low drinking fountain between the two doors. And it says in new construction, all toilet and bathing facilities must be accessible. We all understand that, right? Even if it's on a floor that doesn't have vertical access, right? Even if it's a two-story building and there's no vertical access in that two-story building, but they have a toilet room upstairs, it would still be fully compliant. So all toilet and bathing facilities must be accessible, including employee-only facilities, except for those portable units, it's 5%. We're going to go into a little bit more of that. And remember that unisex toilet room or family room, whatever you're going to call it, cannot substitute for access to provide in multi-user toilet rooms. So if you're providing in new construction multi-user toilet rooms, it doesn't limit your obligation for accessibility in those if you just provide an accessible family restroom. There is this idea, though, that if it's in an alteration, and you can't make those existing toilet rooms accessible, that you could do a unisex or family restroom, and that would be okay. But in new construction, no, that unisex restroom cannot substitute for access into multi-users. And that was an issue that we heard of regularly, as well as this clustered single toilet rooms exception. Remember that is only for clustered toilet rooms and not clustered bathing rooms. That's a really big one. If you provided individual bathing rooms, okay, maybe it has a transfer shower or a shower, a toilet, and a sink, and there was multiple ones of those in the same location, it would require 100% of those to be accessible. Okay. Whereas if it was just a toilet room, a toilet and a sink, or meets the requirements for the toilet rooms, it would be 50% of those that are clustered in one location that serve the same users. Okay. So the idea here is it's serving the same population of people, but it's all in one location. And my next slide here on slide 25 is a graphic of just that, where there's single user toilet rooms scattered around one floor in a clustered around this area. And you could imagine that this might be maybe someplace where you had to go to leave a specimen. Maybe it was some, work site testing or evaluation for you, and you had to go into a single user toilet room to leave a specimen, something like that. Then the single room or single toilet room cluster exception permits that only 50% of those would need to be accessible. The other exception under 213 is that portable toilet and bathing. Now here, if you have portable bathing and portable toilets, okay, it's 5% of the toilet or bathing units at each cluster. So where you're clustering these together would be 5%, no less than one. And in slide number 26, I'm showing a graphic where it shows a ramp up to the clear floor space. Do not put these in the grass. Don't put them up on the curb if they're the accessible one. Try to provide more than the 5% because everybody wants to use these, right? These are the larger one. If you're going in with a kid, you're going in with a spouse that needs help, you're going in with somebody that's got a service animal or a mobility device. Everybody wants the accessible one. I suggest you provide additional above this minimum requirements to facilitate greater access and independence by everybody. It's showing it ramped up here, but remember at the door surface, it would need to have a clear floor space and that door maneuvering clearance. You're seeing that the door maneuvering clearance is provided with that offset on the pull side. Make sure that the portable toilets you're really providing are single toilet rooms, right? They'd have to have the 5-foot turning circle in there. You need to make sure that the grab bars are in the right position and that the center line of the water closet is provided, and that your toilet paper dispensers and your grab bars are all provided in the right locations. Now, I've seen many where you can actually, you don't have the clear floor space for the mobility device to sit exactly right next to the toilet or water closet. And some of those honestly make it a little bit easier for me. They're non-compliant in that, remember, you need to have that 30-inch clear floor space adjacent to the side of that water closet. But to me, that little bit of extra space really is helpful to get onto that before I get onto the toilet or back into my wheelchair, can provide to me greater access, I think. But remember that there is that opening requirement, 32-inch minimum to get through the door. It also requires that these be identified with the international symbol of accessibility. And we're showing in this slide number 26 it above the door. Now, it could be on the door. Sometimes they put it above the door, but typically I see it on the door. Going forward with still in toilet and bathing, and I think one of the things we see more often now, right, is this toilet compartment that has floor to ceiling partitions or doors or just a little bit under the door, right? People want additional privacy, or sometimes we even see these now in a unisex multi-user toilet room where they have individual water closets in these larger stalls that are full partitions. Or we see individual toilet rooms that are along a corridor or hallway. So that's the distinction I want you to make. Toilet compartments are stalls that are in a multi-user room, whereas toilet rooms would be off of a corridor or hallway, and they would have individual entrance doors off that common corridor instead of off a central room. So the difference is those two are treated very differently, right? One of the issues in stalls, and I'm on slide number 28, one of the issues with stalls is that it requires toe clearance. And this is one of the things people I don't think often remember, is that the idea once you're in that stall and the ability to maneuver really is dependent upon the ability to get your toes underneath those partitions to increase the size of it, right? And so toe clearance is required per Chapter 6. Here I'm showing you on slide number 28 several different graphics. I'm showing you an elevation for an adult, an elevation for children, and also a plan view and over top that's showing the minimum of 6-inch clearance around one side in the front. The children's elevation requires a minimum of 6 inches beyond that partition on the outside, but at 12 inches minimum from the floor surface. And the adult partition would be, again, that minimum 6 inches beyond the partition outside the stall, at a height of 9 inches minimum for toe clearance. And so those are required along one side wall and the front of the accessible stall. Now, what happens if you're doing full height partitions where you're not providing that additional toe space to get your feet and that maneuvering space needed sometimes to turn around? I'm showing you here on slide number 29, where I have a photo of two open doors, but basically toilet stalls off of a room with full height partitions and full height doors. So what happens then? Well, there's an exception in 604.8.1.4 that says toe clearance at the front partition is not required in compartments that are greater in size. So now what we're going to do is we're going to incorporate that toe space into the size of your compartment. So basically what happens is if you can't provide along one side wall and one front wall that additional toe space, the size of the stall just gets larger. Okay, so greater than 62 inches deep with a wall hung and a water closet, or 65 inches deep with a floor mounted water closet. Now, why would it be bigger with a floor mounted, right? The reason is you can't get your toes underneath it like a wall mounted, right? Reduced usability, reduced toe clearance underneath, because now it's a floor mounted and not a wall hung. So where toe clearance at the side partition is not required in a compartment that's greater than 66 inches wide. Nancy.
We've had a question here related to the partition supports. How wide, I don't know if you can speak to this, how wide can a support be when it restricts toe space?
That's a good one. We see them all sizes, don't we? We see them in a corner. Sometimes they're 6 inches in each direction at the corner. The standard doesn't specify it. It says that you can have those partitions, and it can obstruct your toe clearance in those corners. It doesn't give a specific size. The smaller, the better, right? The smaller, the better in each direction. Make those as small as possible. Choose products for your locations that have those minimum. Sorry to say, I think if you're starting to obstruct quite a bit of that toe space, I would look at trying to increase the size of the stall. Or remember what we're talking here? Minimums, right? We're talking minimums. Who doesn't want independent access in a toilet stall? Okay, you do. You want as much independent access as you possibly can get in there. Don't design just to the minimums. What I'm talking to you about here are just minimums. Try to increase these wherever you can. Make them a little bit larger. But the standard doesn't specify how big those corner partition supports can be. I would
So
just
I have to focus on usability, huh?
really focus on usability here. And if it's obstructing too much of it, you should really look at trying to increase these sizes based on the type of water closet you're providing, and increase that width and depth.
Thanks.
Great question. We're moving on. We're still in the toilet rooms. My suggestion is don't put the baby changing station in the accessible stall. Okay, I'm on slide number 30 here, and I'm doing some overhead graphics of baby changing station in plan view, and then one from the front with several different diagrams that I'll talk about. The baby changing station in the accessible stall is permitted, but you already have everybody trying to use that same stall, right? You have somebody that's bringing their child in, somebody that's helping their spouse. You got everything else going on there. Don't take the one that's there for accessibility for the baby changing station too. Put that outside if you can. Okay. But these minimum requirements we're going to talk about is regardless of where you've put them in there. Okay. If it's a single user, if it's in the stall of a multi-user, make sure that they're not more than 4 inches leading deep. If it's higher than 27 inches, that's the protruding object requirement. We were talking earlier about drinking fountains. Make sure you've got the forward approach. Remember, you got to make sure there's a forward approach there. And then we're looking for it to be a work surface. It needs to be accessible work surface. Accessible work surface is between 28 and 34 inches. So we're looking for knee and toe space, right? Forward approach, clear, compliant work surface from chapter 9. Make sure that it's operable, that you can reach it, pull it down, that it's no higher than that 48 inches to that. Maybe it's going to take a strap or something to reach that top part to get to it. You know, when you're folded down to think about 28 to 34, can you do that and still reach the top with 48 to get it down? I think you need to meet all those operable part requirements. Okay. The amount of force it takes. Can I do it with one closed fist? Is there some way within the reach ranges? You may have to sit parallel to pull it down, but to use it, you need a forward approach. Nancy.
We have a great question about the baby changing station and the knee clearance. Is the 17 inches minimum knee clearance required there? Some recessed models apparently don't give you that.
I would say that, remember, you'd want to be compliant with that 305. You'd want it 306. We don't specify that space has to be, I don't believe. I don't think you get 306. I think it requires a forward approach, but I don't think it gives you 306. We're only stating in this graphic here you're only getting 305.
Well, I'll look that up while you look that one up too.
It would be nice. I think that, you know, full knee and toe space, you want to get underneath that as best as you can, right? Especially when you're lifting something up on and off that. A young child that's got some weight to it, you'd want to be up underneath it to give yourself the leverage and be able to use it. I don't believe there's a requirement to get all the way underneath that, though.
I'll look in that too.
Yeah, that would be helpful. Compliant work surface typically would get you full knee and toe space. 902 work surface would. Okay, the other thing, watch about the clear floor space. Remember, you can't overlap fixture clearances or maneuvering clearances when stowed. Here I'm showing in the graphic on the left-hand side of slide number 30 that the clear floor space forward approach is overlapping some of the fixture clearances, but it's not in the stowed position. It's down in the up position. Okay, I'm moving on to slide number 31, and I thought I'd throw this one in here. It's slide number 31 on the far left side. This was a Minneapolis St. Paul Airport, and they had an overhead track and lift system that would run you from the adult changing table all the way over to the water closet and back, or off to one side. It was quite an overhead track system. I have not seen where building standards are trying to bring in this overhead lift yet, but the adult changing table is coming in the ANSI document, and will be coming forward in large assembly areas, this requirement to provide an opportunity for adults to have a changing table in certain occupancies. And the idea here was that this surface, and I've seen them both where they move up and down, and also where they are fixed at a transfer height between 16 and 18 inches. So I've seen them both ways. I think the electric or adjustable height might provide more independence and usability by a wider audience. Remember, you're looking for clear floor space, operable parts if they do operate. And this one had a lot of instructions on the wall about how to operate this. It also had a removable pad that could be taken on or off. Quite a setup they had there at the airport. But in your model building code, the requirement for these in certain facility and occupancies and assembly areas will be looking to start to provide these adult changing stations or tables. Nancy's back. What do you say? 902 gets you knee and toe.
Yes, it does. It gets you all the way to 17 inches toe clearance. So
it does.
Yes, a baby changing table it's definitely a work surface, right?
It is.
You're working on that.
Yep. So there it is.
There it is.
Compliant work surface at 902 would get you back to 306, which would get you full knee and toe, which would be a minimum of 17 inches underneath the element. So good catch. Good question.
Good questions.
We got some stumpers with us today. Transient lodging guest room scoping was one of the other issues we wanted to bring up today, and that guest room with mobility features. First, remember, it's your choice, but remember, you got to pick one. And oftentimes it might not be your choice, and I'm going to highlight that further here, but it's going to be a transfer shower, an accessible tub, a roll-in shower, or the alternate roll-in shower. And I have my bias. I'm a paraplegic, and I really prefer either the transfer or roll-in or a tub with the permanent seat, not a removable bench. Too hard to transfer for me. Remember that the idea on the scoping would be that they're dispersed among the many classes of guest rooms that are available to everybody else. So if it's two twins, it's a king, it's got a beach view, it's got a balcony, it's whatever we got going on, and everybody else we're still looking to make sure that individuals with disabilities have that same opportunity, whether it's the type of beds, the amount of amenities, the type of room that's being provided. Remember, there's this requirement too that all other guest rooms have to provide visibility, which means a 32-inch minimum door opening size. Okay, 32-inch minimum door opening size to all guest rooms. That's the visibility issue. Even if it's on the second floor of a two-story hotel, not required to provide vertical access. It would still require all doors, guest room doors, to provide a 32-inch minimum clear width. Don't forget about all the other things there, right? The saunas, the steam rooms, the parking, the restaurants, the passenger loading zones. How about areas of sport activities, maybe a play area? How about in their assembly spaces, the opportunity for assisted listening systems, their service counters, their swim pools, their locker rooms, their fitness facilities? All of those would need to comply. Okay, so we're going to move on. Besides just that, the scoping requirements can be found on slide 33 here, and it's got a graphic of the door with the key in it. I don't know how many times you get a key anymore. Most of the time, it seems like it's a card. Keys are gone. Guest rooms with mobility features. This scoping table is found in Chapter 2 and 224. And the one thing that I'd like to tell you about this is, remember, it's a minimum number of rooms required without roll-in showers, and then a minimum number of rooms required with roll-in showers in the table, and total number of required rooms. And so it's based on how many rooms are provided in the facility. But, let me back up. My preference, I told you, is I'm a manual wheelchair user, and the roll-in shower just seems to fit more opportunities than not. And to think that the standard doesn't get you a roll-in shower, okay, you don't get a roll-in shower until you've got at least 51 guest rooms, can be really challenging, right, for small facilities that want to provide that extra opportunity for greater accessibility. The standard limits that. But anyway, if you're looking for the number of guest rooms that need to provide mobility features, you go to Chapter 2, 224, and look at this matrix and count the number of existing that are currently there. Now, remember, transient lodging can be more than just a big hotel or motel. It could be cabins. It could be whatever else you're renting, okay? So if you're renting for overnight sleeping, provide restroom facilities, things like that, you need to be looking at transient lodging. And cabins that are provided for rent around the lake would still have this minimum requirement. Hi, Nancy.
I'm back. This is a great group here that has some really good questions. First of all, though, just want to take a second for anybody that's maybe not familiar with the standards and how they're kind of organized. When we refer to scoping, which is mostly found in chapter 2 of the standards, that's where you look to find which spaces or elements need to be accessible, or how many of multiple types of spaces or elements need to be accessible. So when we say scoping, that's what we're talking about, how many or percentage or things like that. And we have a question about, you mentioned that even in every single guest room in a place of lodging, that door has to have that 32 inches minimum clear width. But what about in those non-accessible rooms? Do they also have to comply with provisions related to protruding objects?
I've not seen where that's ever been enforced. I never have. I think, remember, protruding object requirements are in common circulation paths. And so typically inside your private guest room, it's not considered a circulation path that I've seen. And so I've not seen protruding object requirements brought into that level. Remember, it's all part of the circulation path. Typically a private guest room doesn't have those protruding objects. I think it's a great idea. Yeah, I think it's a great idea to make sure that you don't have something that could protrude in there and really, at eye level or below, or that somebody that would be tracking the wall or looking for wayfinding, reaching out and finding things, that you wouldn't have something that could protrude out in there. I think it's a great suggestion. I just have not seen the standards applied that way.
Yeah, that's a great thought though, because a person who's blind in many cases might be staying in any guest room, and if you've got light fixtures sticking off the hanging way off the wall or something, they could be hazardous. And it's always good to think about safety issues. But now
I would try to still minimize. I'd still try to minimize that 4-inch projection. Anything above 27, I'd try minimize that in the room if possible. Put things in an alcove, safety. Any kind of hooks or anything. Don't go out more than 4 inches. That type of thing.
Yeah, use some lower profile appliances and things. We got a couple questions now following up on, you were talking about scoping for guest rooms and everything. Just to reiterate, so if you've got a place of lodging that has between 1 and 25, and fewer than that number of rooms, you would not be required to have a roll-in shower. Is that correct?
Yeah, the standard, you don't get a roll-in shower to 51, actually 52. Yeah, so now here's the thing is, remember the Americans with Disabilities Accessibility Standards do provide an opportunity that if you can do something greater or better than the standard requires, that the standard permits in section 103, chapter 1, what they call equivalent facilitation. And I've seen where small facilities have used equivalent facilitation to say that they are providing something better than the transfer shower. Now, that's a personal choice, though, and some people may prefer one over the other. I think that the roll-in shower can facilitate greater access, especially if you've got the fold-down seat and everything there and the controls done right. Not a sloped floor, entrance is fine, all that stuff. I just think it can facilitate a lot of great opportunities. But the standard, correct, is a scoping table that brings you to when roll-in showers are permitted and not.
Right. So in those smaller facilities where it says, rooms without a roll-in shower, that's where you are, unless you want to.
Yeah, you got the transfer, or you've got the alternate. I don't know. Yeah, you probably can't do the alternate roll in either. So all you have is the transfer, or you have the tub. Yep.
unless you
And
wanted to consider it an equivalent facilitation because you
remember,
really wanted to provide.
if you're doing the tub, remember, if you're not doing the permanent seat, that's at the head of the tub, the opposite end where the controls are. If you're not doing that, you've really created a shower situation with a temporary seat or a temporary bench in and over the top of a tub, because most people can't get onto that temporary bench and then into the tub. So you're creating a shower facility really out of a tub when you start providing that temporary or portable bench. If you provide that permanent seat or permanent bench at the head of the tub, that's really more realistic to use it as a tub.
Right, to be able to get down
Into it and back
down
out
in
of it.
there.
That's what the
Yeah,
grab bars are
yeah.
meant for there. Yeah.
Now we have a great question because you mentioned cabins, so they would presumably be sort of detached, scattered about. Would each cabin be required to have an accessible route to connect to get to it?
No, it wouldn't. It'd be similar to that example that I gave to you about a two-story hotel not requiring vertical access. Remember, not if it's 2 stories, a lot of times there's vertical access not required if it's a place of public accommodation or a commercial facility, depending on size. But there could be an exemption from providing vertical access in a two-story hotel. It'd be similar to that, that the door width would need to be accessible, but there's no requirement for an accessible route all the way into that unit.
We do have one more question, and this is more kind of a usability question, and I know it's a big topic. Could you maybe speak a little bit to the issue of the height of the actual beds in transient lodging or open
Yeah.
platform, open underbeds, those issues, because sometimes they're built in, sometimes they're not. Can be a problem for
Yeah.
usability.
I'll tell you what, I wish the day of an adjustable guest room bed would be here. Okay. You could facilitate such greater independence. I can't tell you how many times I've had to have somebody remove the topper, take out the box springs, get it off the pedestal, do something because it's too high. I can't get on it. Um, I have photos of myself sitting on the bed and you can't even see the wheelchair. It's sitting next to the bed. It's so tall. They are a challenge. They really are a challenge. Too low's too tough, too high's too tough. So where do we go? What's that required height? There is not one right now, right? I mean, the Department of Justice is the only one that can come out with something like this on furniture. I'm hoping that they do. I'm hoping they make it a range. I strongly think that in the accessible rooms, you ought to mix up the heights and know the heights and advertise the heights of your beds in the accessible rooms, because it can be a make or break for people to be able to stay there. It's very similar to whether or not you can get the accessible room with the roll-in shower, or if you need the tub. It can be really challenging when you think about the minimum number that are really required to be accessible out of all the ones they have, and whether or not that's going to facilitate access for you. Remember, independently and safe is what we're after. And so can it really facilitate in this environment, a safe environment? I've had to take a full run at a bed before just to try to throw myself at it to see if I could get it. They are a real challenge. The other thing that you brought up is that pedestal underneath the bed. In the accessible rooms, I would put your beds on 4 legs. Give the space underneath there so that somebody that brings their own portable lift has an opportunity. Instead of swinging somebody over there to try hit the bed, they can actually lift and
Get up close.
get it underneath there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Make it
I have
safe.
seen recommendations for bed heights ranging anywhere from 17 to about 23 when the bed is compressed, which I think is important if folks are going to be measuring, to the top of bed heights, that you sort of, lean on it or compress it a bit, because that's what's going to happen when you go to get in and out of it. And so 17 is sort of your, similar, it's a transfer element. So similar to things like toilet seats or transfer walls or other things that you would transfer to. I think that gives us some guidance as to what may be usable.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the elderly population, which I'm probably in now, but that elderly population that is still ambulatory does want it pretty high so that they have an easier time to stand or get out of it. For me, the very foamy or very cushiony type of toppers make it almost impossible for me to roll around on and move. They are so difficult. It's like being in quicksand. I prefer a firmer bed, so I transfer into bed and have to dress in bed. And so that movement around on a really soft topper and getting dressed is really a challenge. But there's ways to definitely make guest rooms better. And one of them would be to analyze the seat heights. I honestly think in an accessible room, if it's got two beds, put them at two different heights. Okay, give people an opportunity of choice that way at least. Okay, maybe one does that is on a pedestal and one's not. Maybe one's higher, one's lower. Give people those choices in those accessible rooms whenever possible.
Some great thoughts. Well, thank you for all that. I think I'm going to let you move on a little bit now.
Yeah. So we're still in the guest room with mobility features, and I'm currently on slide number 34, and it just talks about some of those other things that are required. Remember, to make sure that when we're talking about those guest rooms, that the accessible guest room really has the same opportunities and amenities for independent and safe access. So things like the living and dining spaces are accessible. Think about the exterior spaces. How would somebody get out there? Can they turn around? Can they move? Is the threshold too big? Kitchen and kitchenettes are things within reach ranges. Do they meet the requirements for a fridge or dishwasher or a sink? Is there turning space within that guest room? How can people get maneuvering and turning in there? A lot of loose furniture is tough for me. In the accessible guest rooms, for me, I don't need a chair at the desk. I'm bringing my own. And so a lot of times that loose furniture is just in the way for me. At least one sleeping area with a clear floor space. Okay, so it only requires one bedroom. If you got two bedrooms in a suite, try make them both accessible. Try make sure that two people with disabilities could stay in the same unit and still have opportunities. It does only require one bathroom. That has at least no fewer than one water closet, one lavatory or bathtub or shower, as we talked. That comparable vanity space, you see, we lose that a lot of times because of the clear floor space required at the toilet or water closet. The image that I'm showing you here on slide 34 actually has an own area where the counter is big and open and gives you a lot of space to use. And there is not a requirement for vertical access to a second story within the same guest room if all the accessible features could be provided on the lower level. Okay, so I'm moving on to slide number 35, and it brings that accessibility into transient lodging guest rooms to the communication features. And remember, when we were talking about communication features, it gets you into chapter 8. 806 is where you find transient lodging requirements. But when we talk about the communication feature rooms, we're talking about alarms. So where emergency alarm systems are provided, they have to meet the requirements in 702. They have to be provided in this guest room. And it also talks about the notification devices. And those are the visual alarms, not visual alarms, but visual notification devices to alert the room occupant that there's an incoming telephone call or that there's a door knock or bell. That availability is there to see visually. That telephones have volume control, and that there also be an outlet within 48 inches of that telephone to facilitate the use of a TTY. As Nancy earlier said, what I read to you was some of the technical requirements, remember, in chapter 8. But the scoping is where you find this table. And the scoping, again, is how many of what. And it's used for parking, transient lodging. It's used for every element based on what's provided, how many need to be accessible. We call that scoping in chapter 2. And here we're looking at 224, and it's the guest rooms with communication features. So how many of those need to be accessible? Okay, so it says that at least one shall have the mobility features we talked about, but also the communication features of the alarms and notification devices. But not more than 10% of the guest rooms that provide mobility features can be used to provide those communication features as well. And there's a scoping table here. You can see that 2 to 25, you get 2, and it starts going up as that population of transient lodging guest rooms do too. When you think about it, there's going to be a percentage with communication features. You're going to have minimal overlap, but at least one of mobility and communication feature rooms. We're going to move now into counters versus work surfaces versus dining surfaces. And so when we think about things that are used for extended use, it's more like the work surface and dining surface, right? We're going to be there for a while. When we think about counters. We think about maybe I'm there for a few minutes, I'm buying something, I've got a transaction, I'm at a ticket window, maybe it's a checkout aisle, maybe it's an information kiosk, something like that. That would be more the counter type of issue. And so we thought we'd clarify a little bit of it. And here we should have probably gone to this slide after we talked about baby changing stations, because that work surface height is 34 inches to the top of the surface, but does require that full knee and toe space on any work surface or accessible dining surface. For a service counter, it's your choice. You can provide either. You can provide a parallel approach with a 36-inch high maximum counter height, or you can provide a forward approach with knee and toe space, again at 36 inches. So your work surface height max, your dining surface height max is both at 34, but your sales or service counter max is 36 inches from the finished floor, providing either a parallel or forward approach. Slide number 38 goes into that work surface. And remember, under the Americans with Disabilities Act, the scoping applies to work surfaces for public use or common use. Okay, so we're thinking things like a library, a school, excluding that use by employees. And that provision, again, is found in the scoping requirement. So accommodation for employees with disabilities is required under the ADA under Title I. And so it'd be a job accommodation. But we're talking about work surfaces maybe at the airport, maybe in a terminal, that are there for public or common use. We already talked about that the top of that work surface is 34 inches, and it does require knee and toe space. Mm-hmm. And so I have a slide that brings a little bit up that. The scoping requirement in 226 is, again, Chapter 2, access to at least 5% of the surfaces. Okay, at least 5% applies to both standing and seated surfaces, and dispersion within the space or facility is required. I want to highlight one thing, and I put the provision in here, and it says where dining surfaces are provided for the consumption of food or drink, at least 5% of the seating spaces and standing spaces at the dining surfaces shall comply with the 902 requirements. It doesn't say of each type. Okay, it doesn't say of each type. It just says 5%. Now, that's of each type sometimes can be that clarification. Here we're saying standing and seated spaces, but we're saying that that is really the only typing that we're talking about. We're not saying inside and outside spaces, though I would suggest that that dispersion requirement would make it so that you facilitate access in as many of those areas that everyone else has that same opportunity. In slide 39, I'm also showing a graphic on the upper left that shows that minimum knee and toe space. Okay, it's showing that at that 27 inches minimum, we have 8 inches of knee clearance. Okay, this is a graphic directly straight out of the U.S. Access boards. And on the right-hand side, I'm showing you a graphic of just a dining surface and a work surface. So what examples of counters are covered? This is slide number 40. And this type of counters, it's every single type. Okay, it's all kinds. Any kind of sales counter, reception counter, concierge, information counters, registration or check-in type counters, ticket or service counters, customer service, ordering, pickup, drop-off. If you had all three of those counters, a order, a pickup, a drop-off, all three of those counters would need to be accessible. Remember, it's one of each type. Other types of sales service counters, display, exhibit counters, covered only if they're function as a sales and service counter. So you could have a display counter, but if it doesn't serve as a sales or service counter too, it doesn't need to meet these minimum requirements. So the scoping is at least one of each type of counter, each type of function at the counter, and dispersion among the types of counters provided. And I put a resource there on an animation that U.S. Access Board staff created on these sales and service counters, and it's a great one. I honestly think the best way to see provisions and understand them is to see how they impact usability, right? To see how somebody really uses things. I've got a picture here on slide number 41, and it was a counter that we took at a sales or service counter, a photo that we took at a hotel that incorporated the accessible location off to the side, but it provided knee and toe space all at the same counter. And it was all part of the same counter. I like to see the lowered portion of the accessible counter. Remember, 36 inches. A lot of times 36 inches, I think to staff feels like it's too low. They want a higher counter. So typically there's more than one level of counter. But if you're looking at the requirements about the depth, the depth and how much based on parallel or forward approach, this animation can really help you understand more of the technical requirements for these sales and service counters. Moving into dining surfaces, I just wanted to show that there is the possibility to have access at tables instead of bars if they're located in the same room, same area, equal level of service or experience, and that the tables are fixed. Okay, it requires fixed dining surfaces. Must rely on equivalent facilitation under the Americans with Disabilities Act, and something we haven't talked about yet, and that's the Architectural Barriers Act for federal facilities. They have what's called a modification and waiver and not equivalent facilitation. So here's what we're saying. That remember it said 5% of the seated spaces would be required to be accessible and standing spaces. So in the graphic that I'm showing you on slide number 42, there's tables, but they're non-fixed. And it's showing you a bar counter. If all they had, the only fixed dining surface that they had in this facility was the bar, that would need to provide accessible dining surface. Okay. But if they had a fixed dining tables in the same area, same equal level of service, same experience, located in the same room or area, you could get away without providing a lowered area at the bar, the fixed dining surface at the bar. The idea here is to recommend to integrate accessible seating with all the other seating. I'm showing you one where it's on the end of the bar, and I'm showing you one where the whole bar has been lowered. In the 1991 standard, you used to get 60 inches at the bar. In the new standard, the dining and work surface is only a 30-inch width. Okay, so it's seating for one person, basically. Look at how you can create these spaces that are more inclusive, that are multi-generational, that put everybody on the same level, that they're integrated into the space, and give everybody that equal opportunity. Speaking about equal opportunity in temporary facilities is one to hard to find equal opportunities a lot of times. I'm showing you on slide number 44 a row of accessible or non-accessible portable toilets, and also just a fair where people are walking, and there's a common circulation path there. They've used the sidewalk and they've put vendors on either side of that hard surface. And that's what I recommend. Think about the location of where things are. These portable toilets are put on the hard surface. Don't put them up in the grass. Make sure that everybody has access to them. If there's a lip greater than a ½ inch to get in, you need to ramp it. And remember, there has to be a level landing at the door for maneuvering space. So that's why I was showing you that earlier picture. On slide 44 here, it just is telling you that in chapter 2, we say these requirements shall apply to temporary and permanent buildings and facilities. Okay, so there is a requirement that your temporary facilities provide access, whether that be a parking, a passenger loading zone, your toilet facilities, maybe it's drinking fountains. I was at a fair recently where the only hand washing station they had, you had to pump it with your foot. Okay, there was no way for somebody using a mobility device that didn't have the use of their foot to be able to actuate that opportunity. So think about the structures that you're providing there, the exhibit areas, the types of platforms or the things that you're providing. Maybe they're screening facilities, maybe they're exercise facilities, maybe it's something that is at an athletic competition. Think about how you're providing these unique opportunities in temporary facilities and make sure that everybody can participate and nobody's excluded. Benches is one of those questions we get all the time, and whether or not a bench out on the pier at the lake or a bench in your courtyard or atrium needs to comply with the requirements that you find for dressing, fitting, and locker room benches. Oftentimes we say that if there's not a specific requirement for the element or standard or facility or space that you're providing, that you look to the standards, right, for guidance. But this is a really different type of bench. I'm showing you a graphic on slide 44 on the right-hand side of a locker room with an accessible bench near the accessible lockers, and on the left, an atrium or a courtyard area of a office park with benches outside, and then also a bench on a fishing pier platform. And the bench that's put in the locker room or a dressing fitting locker room is where the scoping requirements are. It also addresses it in detentional correctional facilities and courtrooms, because the idea here is you're changing your clothes. You're not sitting with your honey with your arm around your kids and looking at the lake or just eating your lunch out in the courtyard for the day. This bench is designed for somebody to roll around on and get dressed. And so providing a dressing bench out in the built environment in other areas where it's not for dressing is typically not appropriate. And I would recommend that the requirements for the dressing or fitting or locker room bench is not what you should be looking for when you're providing an atrium or a bench in another area along a trail, a shared use path, or something like that. Look at what you're providing and make sure that the type of facility is what actually requires here the scoping. So I think armrests are better on the public benches. There's scoping requirements currently in a new requirement out for public rights of way. So if your benches are in the public rights of way, about 50% of those benches need to comply. They don't tell you what it is. It doesn't say armrests are back. It just basically says that it has to be provide a clear space that's not obstructing the route to the bench. So it doesn't really define what a sitting bench should provide. I believe armrests do facilitate greater access by certain people that need help getting up or down. And I do think a back support is always needed for most people to sit for any length of time for stability. Shopping or shipping lockers, I had this frustration just recently where I couldn't reach the locker they put my stuff in, and I had to get staff to help. And so I thought I'd throw this in there and talk about that they would be required to be on an accessible route, that a percentage of them would, at least one of each size type, would need to be provide an operable part and accessible. And it's so important that the opportunity to get your materials sent to one of these safe places or pick up, that they provide a level of access at them. So consider those when you're looking at those for any type of survey or facility inspection you're doing. I want to move into handrail extensions, and we're going to start with the ramps first. And this figure on slide 47 as handrail ramps. And I think some of the things I'd like to talk to you about is that the obstruction along the bottom, the surface can only be obstructed 20% of the full length, that the handrail's got to be continuous for the full length of the run, and tops and the side of the gripping surface cannot be obstructed. The side and the top. This, when you're doing handrails on ramps or stairs, there's not a minimum distance from the sidewall. These can be freestanding and be quite a ways, right, away from things. There's not that thought that you're going to get trapped by going behind something. But it does require extensions, and you see them highlighted here. And I'm going to go into further of those, but they're 12 inches minimum long in the same direction of travel and required at the top and bottom. I can't tell you how many times I've seen where the landing, starts too soon or too late, and you can't get this, or they try to wrap the handrail around the corner or something, and they don't put it in the same direction. Okay. It needs to be level and in the same direction. And it's measured, that 12 inches is measured from the start of the return of the radius. Okay, in the upper graphic, I'm showing a little highlighted area that shows where that return starts. So you're looking at it for a minimum of 12 there. Remember, we don't want it less than 27. So extensions with the leading edge 27 high max can extend any amount from posts. Those with a leading edge higher than 27, they're limited to 12-inch protrusion, and that's because it's on a post, and the requirement there for protruding objects is in 307.3. So the sloping portion of the handrails, remember, comply with the requirements for protruding, do not have to comply with the requirements for protruding objects. It's just those end pieces, the extensions. When we move to handrail extensions on slide number 48, they're a little bit different than ramps, okay? In that 12-inch horizontal extension at the top of the same direction of the stair flight, remember, is no longer sloped, whereas at the bottom, the handrail must return to the floor guard or the or the wall, and cannot rotate in its fittings. But remember, it is in the same direction. Sloped bottom extensions, 1 tread depth minimum beyond the last riser, nosing in the same direction of the stair flight. And so that can be kind of confusing, right? In stairs, you want to continue beyond 1 tread width in the same downward slope or upward slope. But at the top, you go horizontal. Right? And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And here it's in the bottom of the graphic here, it says, in alterations, full handrail extensions are not required where they would project into a circulation path and pose a hazard. That is only in alterations. Don't consider this in new construction. It should be built correctly in new construction. So that top handrail extension, again, we already talked about, but it's in 12 inches horizontally above the landing, beginning directly above the first riser nosing. Remember, measured to the start of that turn, 12 inches minimum, must be horizontal at the top. Slide number 50 shows that bottom extension again in the same direction, 1 tread width minimum, okay, but it's in that same beyond the last nosing in the slope of the stairway flight for a distance equal to 1 tread depth. And here I'm showing you the different ways you can do that. Remember, you return to a post, you return to a wall, or you return to the floor. And I'm showing all 3 of those different graphics on slide 51 with the return to the guard on the left. The return to the wall is the image in the center, and the return to the floor, that 12-inch minimum handrail extension on stairs, is shown on the far right. Slide 52 is talking about kitchens and kitchenettes, and it's where the room where food is prepared or cooked. And we had some questions about this, but remember, a kitchen could be a commercial kitchen, a common use. Maybe it's in a common use area in a rec center or something. Commercial kitchen, that would be under the Architectural Barriers Act, where work areas are required to be fully compliant. It could be a classroom kitchen or a kitchenette. Maybe it's a break room or lounge. It could have a cooktop, a range, an oven. Maybe it's only got a microwave or a toaster, but it's where food's being prepared. So the question always comes up is, when do I have to have knee and toe space underneath the sink in a kitchenette or a kitchen? Forward approach is required at the knee and toe, but if you have a wet bar or where no cooktop or conventional range is provided, in 606.2, it says that you can provide a parallel approach. Now, some state codes I've seen say that if you're providing a microwave, you still have to provide that knee and toe space. But currently, the federal standard says if there's at a wet bar or where there's no cooktop or conventional range, you can provide a parallel approach at a kitchenette sink. Moving on to assistive listening systems, where required, anytime you're speaking in a microphone in an assembly area, okay? It could be outside, it could be inside. But if you're speaking on a microphone in an assembly area, you need to provide assistive listening systems. You'll see this graphic on slide 54, probably most often anymore at movie theaters, things like that, where they're advertising the opportunity to get an assistive listening system because they're broadcasting. Each separate movie theater would provide this opportunity. There's an exception where no audio amplification is provided. Courtrooms don't get that exception. All courtrooms would have to provide assistive listening. It's not triggered by the occupancy load or fixed seating. Remember, it's only triggered if you're using a microphone, and that signs indicating the availability of these need to be provided when they are. There's lots of ways to provide this, and they're becoming more and more independently usable through broadcast or Wi-Fi, infrared, FM radio, or an induction loop are 3 of the common ways that these are provided. On slide number 56, we talk about the receivers. In the late 90s, I was working for a large assembly seating facility management organization, and at that time, the old standard said 4%. 4% of the seats in your seating area was the trigger or scoping requirement for how many receivers. We were trying to, for a 20,000 seat facility, we had 800 of these receivers. We would barely check out 2 or 3 at a time. The 2010 ADA standards reduced that, the minimum number of receivers required per assembly based on that seating. Remember, scoping table, here it's in 219. 25%, but no fewer than 2 must be hearing aid compatible. And you don't have to have hearing aid compatible where all seats are served by an induction loop. And when we're talking about hearing aid compatible, typically it's the neck loop that's worn around your neck that then can broadcast, if you have a T-coil in your hearing aid, directly through your hearing aid. There are technical provisions in Chapter 7 for assisted listening, and you can see them listed here for receiver jacks, the hearing aid compatibility, the sound pressure level, signal to noise ratio, and peak clipping is my slide number 57. Slide number 58, we're going to move into another subject, and that is EV charging stations and the guidance. These are being constructed everywhere. I've given you a link here to the Access Board's website where there's guidance material that was issued back in 2022 about how to make sure that these are accessible and usable by people with disabilities. Moving on to slide number 59, it shows a graphic of two vehicles parked in a parking area, and each of them has an opportunity to charge their vehicle, one in a head-on position and one in a rear-facing position. Requirements for operable parts: clear floor or ground space at that element, connected to the accessible route. The requirements for Section 508, whether there would be audible or visual, and those opportunities typically only apply to the federal government at this time. I think most manufacturers, though, will create these so that they don't have to create two, and so that all provide accessible versions on the display screen, the input controls, keys and cards, and how you use them, and the automatic fare or the fare machine requirements. Should be looked at. Don't allow these to continue to be put in to where you can't reach them, that they're outside your reach range. I'm showing you a picture of myself on the right of slide number 60, where I can't even reach the element. Now, the real challenge with a lot of these vehicles is we don't know where they're charging, right? Some charge right in the front, some charge on the right quarter panel, some charge in the rear on the rear quarter panel. And that's what makes it real challenging, right? People got to be able to back in or head in and get to these so that they can use that accessible route access aisle to get to the unit itself. So make sure that the vehicle space has the right size, has an access aisle, provides some signage. The guidance document doesn't provide any scoping or how many of what. It just talks about what space is needed and how to install at ground level in the location of the site. I threw in slide number 61 where I moved to, and it's called facility types, because I think there's always a lot of confusion on whether you're creating an accessible route connecting elements on a site, even within a play area or recreation facility. If it's a pedestrian access route, is it a sidewalk, a crosswalk? Is it a shared use path, hikers and bikers, or is it just a pedestrian trail? Understanding the facility type you're creating get you to the requirements for that route. So know what you're creating before you apply route requirements to a specific facility. Anytime you do a gate or a barrier, in the Americans with Disabilities Act, it requires a minimum of 32 inches. Along pedestrian route or trails and outdoor recreation access route, it requires a minimum of 36 inches always be maintained. If the gate's unlocked for some, it needs to be unlocked for all. Accessible gate hardware needs to be available, and the opportunity to participate oftentimes it is limited by gates or barriers. I wanted to briefly tell you about synthetic turfs. We used to call them AstroTurfs when it was first come out, but anytime these are used as part of an accessible route, there's a carpet requirement. So in a play area, or if you were using these to connect to a locker room, maybe it's a service animal relief area that's all part of an accessible route. If you're using synthetic turfs, remember there's a 1/2-inch pile requirement for carpets, and that's my slide number 63. Slide number 64, I just wanted to leave you with some resources. We're coming close to the end of this one, with some technical assistance guides, animations, and I'm a person that needs to print. And there is one of the only ways, unless you're going to print that 300-page document yourself, there are ADA and Architectural Barriers Act. There's even public rights-of-way reference field manuals now that are available for purchase. And if you're a person that needs to build standard in front of you to be able to look things up instead of your cell phone, you're not in a service area or you're out in the field doing stuff, these are a great opportunity to make sure you keep them with you. I travel with one just so that when I'm at a transient lodging hotel and they tell me that this is a requirement for the ADA, I can just show them flat out it's not. So I like to use it all the time. I like to keep one in my vehicle and my briefcase at all the time. Finally, I'm going to bring you to a slide that has some contact information for both the U.S. Department of Justice, some phone numbers and websites, and also the U.S. Access Board, where you can get technical assistance and even send an email to the U.S. Access Board for technical assistance and get more of your question and answers, as well as the information we're going to show you for the ADA National Network, where you can get additional information over time. So, Nancy, you got a couple more for me before we end today?
Have several more, and I think we cannot get to all of them, and folks are going to have to maybe give us a call. But I'm going to try to kind of go back to where I stopped taking questions, because I really wanted to make sure that you were able to get through all of your terrific content there. But we do have a couple of good questions that are kind of, I think, very clarifying questions. And you know what,
Okay.
you can move along to the next slide if you like. So one question that we had, there was a confusion about when you talked about benches and the distinction between benches that are kind of out by in the park, or on the boardwalk or something, versus a changing room or a locker room or something. Could you clarify if those sort of outdoor benches and things are actually covered by the ADA?
Well,
or by the standards?
if they're fixed, I would say that they are covered. There's not specific technical requirements or scoping requirements for them in the ADA. And so there's not a specific transfer height, a requirement for backs or armrests, or how many where you provide them. Now, there's been some change to that in some supplements to the Architectural Barriers Act, and now a new standard called public rights of way, where we're addressing benches in the public right of way. But typically, persons that are using a mobility device are not going to be transferring to your sitting bench. They're already sitting in a mobility device. And so the transfer heights, I don't know how important those really are, or transfer supports. I think those are more usable by persons that are still ambulatory. So there's not a transfer height. There's not a requirement for armrest. There's not a requirement for a back for a public sitting bench. I think those things can definitely help. I would offer up that a clear floor space of a minimum of 36 inches wide by 48 inches, a wheelchair parking space near the bench, so that you can sit with your friends, your family, or whoever, hopefully shoulder to shoulder, so you can both look at the same location, that doesn't obstruct the route that everybody's on getting around the bench or near the bench. You're not sitting out there in the traffic lane where everybody's walking, that you're off to the side like the bench is. That's what I'd really recommend for any of those types of sitting benches. Now, the dressing, fitting, and locker benches, those are specifically there so you can get your pants, your skirt back on, your swimsuit, whatever it is. And that's a bench that people are going to be transferring to, and those dimensions are more important.
Great. I hope that clarifies for folks. If we can just maybe move to the final slide, just so we can make sure that folks have our contact information. Call us 800-949-4232. You will get us. If you're in our region, you'll get your own ADA center if you're in another region. And, please do call us. So we did have several questions we weren't able to get to. I think we have just a couple minutes. So there was one other clarifying question.
Just say, if I could just kind of bring it full circle too, and just say that, we've been talking about some unique characteristics that are oftentimes overlooked or misunderstood. And there can be a lot of them. And what I'd really say is that understand where to go look, where to reach out to, find the resource that you can get the information from. Don't build it wrong. Don't do it wrong. Do it right the first time. Really work hard to make sure that we're creating as accessible and multi-generational opportunities that are safe and independent as we possibly can. That's what we're really after, right? Everybody able to participate and be included, but safely, right? Safely. And that's what these minimum requirements do. And I'm hoping that you'll look at things in a different light from here forward and try to make sure you have the right resources to make things right the first time.
And I think that is the perfect note on which to wrap things up for today. And I want to thank you, Bill, for sharing all this great information with everyone. I want to thank everyone who joined us this afternoon, and just give us a call with the rest of your questions that we didn't get to, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.